Alexandra Pringle, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Bloomsbury Publishing in London, and happen to be the very happy and proud publisher of two of the novelists on this panel today. We have three novelists here, but before I start talking about them, I'd just like to say that this is my first time in Pakistan, so obviously my first time in Lahore, and I'm so thrilled to be here. And I hope to come back many, many more times. This is a wonderful festival, and it's so exciting that it's kept going against all odds this weekend. So we have three novelists, three continents, and one subject today, and that subject is love. I will begin with the novelist at the far end, Marion Molteno. She comes from South Africa. She was born there. She then went to the UK and in the 60s, because of the political situation in South Africa. She, along with so many people, had to leave then. Then she went to Zimbabwe, a newly independent place in some turmoil. And after some time, her husband disappeared for 2 months and they had to leave the country. And they came to England, where she's lived ever since. Her second novel, If You Can Walk, You Can Dance, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for the Africa region. And she's just published her new novel, Uncertain Light. Welcome. Next to her is Ahdaf Soueif. I can see that she really needs no introduction to you. As you know, Ahdaf was born in Egypt and educated in the UK, lived there for many years, going between the UK and Egypt, but after the revolution went back and has lived there since. As well as being a novelist, she's a political commentator. She's written short stories, as has Marion, and two novels, In the Eye of the Sun and The Map of Love, which, as you all know, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and was a huge international bestseller. And then, welcome, Ahdaf. And then on her right is someone who absolutely needs no introduction to the audience here, Kamila Shamsie. Of course, as you know, she comes from Pakistan, but she was educated in the United States and then has been going to and fro between Pakistan and the UK. Both Kamila and Ahdaf Bloomsbury publish and have published for many years. Although, first of all, when I met Kamila, she was about 12 and a half years old and still a student. And so she has got under her belt rather a lot of novels because she's so precocious. So I think you're up to number 6. Two of them have been shortlisted for what was then called the Orange Prize and is now called the Bailey's Prize for Women's Literature. And she was also chosen as a Granta Best of Young British Writers. Welcome, Kamila. So now to the thorny question of love. And thinking of these three novelists and where they come from and their work, I think one of the most interesting things is that they all three of them write about love across cultures, and in doing so write about displacement, which echoes, I think, their own lives and their own work. So I'd like each of them to just talk a little bit about that. Kamila, do you want to kick off?
Sure. Before the session, I was thinking about, as novelists, why we're drawn to certain subjects. And of course, the first and sort of obvious answer is because it makes good drama. But I'm thinking specifically of Burnt Shadows in A Garden Every Stone, where you have, since we're talking around love across cultures, where you have, in one case, a Japanese woman and he's pre-partition Delhi wala, but then a Karachi wala after that. So you have Japan and India, Pakistan, and in A Garden Every Stone you have Turkey and Britain. You have these love stories. And what is always interesting is we talk a lot about there's a lot of talk of sort of East-West romance sort of thing. But I'm also interested in what happens where you have people whose nations have these strong political relationships with each other and those that don't. So with Burnt Shadows, I had a woman from Nagasaki and a man from Delhi. And they were able to meet as strangers in a way that had no particular baggage around it. So it wasn't, in addition to being this person I've never seen before from a place I don't know, there was no context of, because you're Japanese and I'm, a South Asian Muslim, there's some freighted history behind all of it. So there's a kind of, I almost want to use the word purity, where it's so rare for two people to meet each other without expectations. I mean, you meet two people of the same nation as you, and there are these instant codes of class and ethnicity and, what kind of Pakistani are you? Do you fit in this category or that category? With Burnt Shadows, it was sort of liberating and fun to have two people who absolutely knew nothing about where the other one came from, and were just it was almost Adam and Eve meeting each other. And with A God in Every Stone, there's a very different situation where there's a British woman and a Turkish man, and then World War II starts, and their nations are at war with each other, and that can't not be an issue for them. But having said that, I want to quickly just add one thing, in that someone asked me the other day, I was at a university in Karachi at IBA, and I was asked, you take on various political things in your work, which has been the one that's been most controversial? And the most controversial thing by far I have ever written for a Pakistani audience was not to do with the 1971 war, and is not to do with Zia ul Haq or anything like that. But in my second novel, Salt and Saffron, there's a woman from an upper middle class family who runs off with the family cook. And more people have come up to me outraged by that than anything I've said about 1971 or any other thorny subject. So, there's a particular, for all that love across culture has its issues, class and, that culture, I think people can take particularly to heart.
Ahdaf.
Yeah, well, following on from Kamila, it's okay. Well, in The Map of Love, I very deliberately chose to have characters who fell in love across conflicted cultures. So, in the old story, A Map of Love is two stories, one that happens at the beginning of the 20th century and one that happens towards the end. And in the first story, it's a British, an English young widow going to Egypt and falling in love with an Egyptian lawyer and activist, as they are now called, but weren't then, of course. And then they were called nationalists, and nationalist now has a kind of fascist tinge to it. So now we say activist. So anyway, so of course at that time Britain was in occupation of Egypt, and so there was very definite conflict between the two countries, and because of that, and because of the time that it was set in, it was actually quite difficult to devise a plot strategy which would make them spend enough time together to actually fall in love. And the kind of romantic, I used to be an avid reader of Mills and Boon, and so there are certain Mills and Boon type tropes that kind of attract me. So there was one notion that there would be a kidnap, and that would be how they would spend time together. But then I couldn't imagine my hero, Sharif al-Baroudi, kidnapping a woman. For whatever kind of patriotic reasons, he couldn't do it. And so the plot became that she was on her own, dressed as a man, going to set off across the desert, which of course mad English women did at that time, mad or intrepid and brave, and therefore got kidnapped by hot-head young patriotic activist Egyptians, who were then horrified to find out that she was a woman and didn't know what to do. And so then they appealed to the older guy, to Sharif, to kind of get them out of this fix. And he, of course, was going to liberate her, but she was insisting on carrying on and going across the desert. So as a gentleman, a gallant, chivalrous gentleman, he was bound to accompany her. So that was the plot device by which they got to spend a week together, traveling across the desert, and so fall in love. But of course, what happened with that story, and I mean, of course, it was very natural, but it wasn't consciously intended, was that the politics came in. Well, I mean, obviously the politics are in it, but the politics very much framed their personal life. And the book became, to a large extent, an exploration of how much freedom the personal life has within the public life. If you are somebody who is engaged, but I mean, everybody's touched by politics, but some people choose not to engage with politics, and some people do engage. So basically, it became really about that. And I'm going to say two more things, which is that Alexandra mentioned displacement, and I had not thought of that. But in fact, of course, Anna is displaced because she goes to Egypt of her own free will, and she stays of her own free will, but she stays because she has found a man she loves. And at one point, his mother, Sharif's mother, sort of delivers a homily to him, which of course I mean, you know, I kind of realize how personal it is now, but she kind of says to him that if you marry this woman, you will be her home and her family, and you know, you can't upset her, basically. You've just got to be really, really good to her. This was while I was living in England, married to a British, well, a Scottish person. So I mean, just suddenly thinking about it, and I hadn't thought about it before. So that's one thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that I was speaking in Columbia University just after Map of Love appeared, well, after it sort of like became famous, and somebody in the audience said to me, in The Eye of the Sun, actually I'm going to say one more thing after this as well, and then I'll be quiet. Somebody in the audience said to me, in The Eye of the Sun, there is so much about love, and there are passages which actually sort of describe love, and that's kind of at the center of the book. And in Map of Love, they fall in love, they get married, and that's it. You don't go into that. And what happened? And I said, 10 years happened. So that was, and now another 10 years have happened. And here I am on this panel trying to do my best. So, and something else that Kamila said about outrages. Well, in The Eye of the Sun, there's an Egyptian woman an Egyptian young woman, student in England, has an affair with an Englishman. A very sorry and miserable affair, actually, which she breaks off. But she has an affair, and she's married. Her marriage is falling apart, but she's a married woman. And that really is what, I mean, I don't know if it actually caused outrage, but it was the tool that was used to attack me at certain points. Again, never mind cross-cultural, but this having an extramarital affair, it was, Soueif has shamed Arab women, because of so, and it's very, you can't talk the language of fiction and literature back to outrage like that. You just have to kind of stand aside and let it pass. So, yeah.
So class and extramarital love, you've both come across. Marion, what about you?
Well, is this microphone working? Yes. You can hear, okay. The word displacement that Alexandra used is very relevant for partly my life, my writing, but the people that I've worked among all my life. And I think one of the effects of having moved countries several times, and the fact that all my working life has been spent with people who have moved countries willingly or unwillingly, either as immigrants to Britain or as refugees from wars and cataclysms of one sort or another, is that I've become an internationalist. I feel connected to people all over the world. I'm extremely interested in cultures, the cultural difference in the sense of how it forms us and how we are part of that, but also react against it. But I think the more I've been in close to people of other culture, of different cultures, the more you come down to the fundamental things in which we are all the same. And I think love is one of those points, obviously, that we all feel across every culture in the world. We all feel very many different kinds of love. And it is, therefore, it is such a basic human need and human pleasure and human problem that it is obviously the stuff of fiction. It's very difficult to imagine taking the lives of imaginary people and empathizing them with them totally and living with them for quite a period of time without love coming into it. So, but I think one of the things that I have found in my writing and in my living is an interest in love of many kinds. That, you know, I as an individual human being, I have a husband, I have children, I have grandchildren, I have friends. People have extramarital relationships, they have people they idealize and then later on find that they're not so ideal. All of these are loves of different kinds. And I think we seldom live at the level of one kind of love. So my novel, my latest novel, Uncertain Light, has love of many kinds in it. And I think that's one of the things that I really loved about writing it and why it took me so long to write. It's got 5 stories interweaving, and each one is in a way a love story, but they're very different kinds of love. So I should just tell you a little bit about the context of the story. It's set among people who work in international development, so they're all mostly working in places which are not their own. So they're all in a cross-cultural situation. But the central character is a South Asian who grew up in Delhi with a Muslim mother, a Muslim father and a Hindu mother, and had a very strong social conscience from the kind of upbringing he had, and became a social activist, setting up his own NGO working among the poor. Now, I worked for many years for Save the Children, an international development agency, and my first visit was to India, and I got taken around meeting people who were working in just those kinds of organizations. And I felt it was a very, very special kind of person. Very often there were people from middle-class backgrounds who had chosen to work among very poor people in a way almost to compensate for the sense of unwanted privilege that they had. And having grown up as a white South African, I have always felt the burden of unwanted privilege all my years in South Africa. And for me, there was no question of living an ordinary life in South Africa, accepting my privilege. I simply couldn't have done it, couldn't have gone to sleep at night. And I felt that there was a very common bond between people who within their own society had made that move across class. I would totally agree with Kamila that I think class is hugely definitive. It's harder to cross a class barrier than it is almost any other, I think, if there's a huge income disparity, because the cultural disparity goes with it as well. So he's the central character, but he's somebody who moves from being a local social activist to working for an international agency, as many do, and then to working for the UN in the refugee project in the UNHCR, and he ends up working with Afghan refugees in Pakistan, and then being sent to Tajikistan in the wake of the civil war, a devastating civil war for 4 years, from 92 to 96-7. And the UNHCR was there. There were 600,000 people internally displaced. There were people running across the border to Afghanistan, drowning in the icy waters as they tried to cross. It was totally traumatic. So the story starts with this refugee worker who is South Asian. He's going on a peace negotiating mission into the mountains, and he is taken hostage along with 22 other people. And eventually 21 people are released and 2 are not released. And the spark for this story was a real incident. I found that story in the news media at the time, of the 21 being taken hostage, everybody panicking. Some days later, 21 were released. Where were the other 2? And I searched and couldn't find the answer. So my story is a fictional account of what happened to the other 2. And one of them is this South Asian activist called Rahul Khan. Now, Rahul Khan disappears. I hope you'll read the story, so I won't tell you exactly how he disappears. But there are 5 people who are intimately connected to him and who love him in different ways. One is a lover, and that is a straight love story, but the others are very close to him, different ways, and for all of them, the loss is devastating. And the story is actually about how they all react to his loss. And I think, for me, that's also one of the things about love, is that if you love, you make yourself vulnerable to loss. People we love are going to die, we're all mortal, we're going to lose them at some point. The love doesn't stop the moment they go. In fact, it infiltrates your life in a very different way. And it's a private way, it's quite difficult to talk about. Even though everybody will support you in your grieving, they want you to take the next step and carry on with life. And actually, you are so infiltrated by that love at that point that it's a very complicated question of how you do it. So this book is not just about love, it's about love and loss and their interaction.
Thank you. When contemplating the work of these writers, I was struck by the fact that both Ahdaf and Kamila have novels with English women in the 19th century or very early 20th century who venture away from home. And I'm just interested to know why they chose that, an English woman.
My English woman was originally an English man. And it was, I mean, the reason for it being an English character was because I wanted to write a story that is set in Peshawar at a certain time period, and the British were there. So, and I want to write about archaeology. And of course, early 20th century, it was very much the British driving, although you did have local archaeologists, but very much it was sort of a British thing, and part of empire was the excavation of history and adding your stamp to that, the history of that area. But the early 20th century, I think, is a really interesting time for women. Of course, we had the whole suffragette movement, and that was part of what was interesting. But I was also interested in the fact that so many women opposed the suffragette movement. Because my character is an archaeologist, the person I had particularly in mind was Gertrude Bell, who, of course, is one of those people who, Ahdaf referred to as the crazy or intrepid English women who made their way around. Gertrude Bell, who was, fantastically involved with politics and archaeology, was also a leading figure of the Anti-Suffragette League, did not think women should have the vote, because, of course, she didn't think other women were like her. But it also allowed for a certain sympathy between the English and the Pashtun woman that doesn't exist today. So you had a woman called Rosita Forbes, much lesser known, but I became interested in her, who was a traveler in the early 20th century, fell out of favor because she liked fascists such as Mussolini and Hitler. But in sort of the 1910s, 20s, 30s, she was very famous and was a traveler and went everywhere. And actually, the character of Viv, my character, came up when I was reading a paragraph she wrote about being in Peshawar in, I think it's 1925 or so. And she's walking through Qissa Khwani, and she sees a woman in a burqa, completely, in a white burqa, completely covered. And there's this moment when they stop and look at each other. And Rosita Forbes doesn't do any of the sort of, oh, the oppressed woman of the whatever sort of thing. Neither does she do this sort of cultural relativism of who am I to judge. But there's a moment when they look at each other. And Rosita Forbes said, I wondered I looked at her in this privacy that the rest of us didn't have. And I wondered what she was thinking of me, and whether she was laughing at the idea of these freedoms of mine that she has no interest in. And of course, we don't know that in any way. I mean, the woman from Peshawar may have been thinking, oh, I wish I could walk around in a skirt. I don't know. But it was still a sort of curiosity and a sympathy, and I think it does come out of the fact, I was also struck by, in those days, in the 1920s, if women in London wanted to go to Parliament to view the proceedings, they had to go to a particular women's gallery, and they had to look through lattice, so that the men downstairs wouldn't see the women and be distracted by them. And I was very struck that it was much like the lattice work on the windows, and in fact like the burqa mesh. And so that this sense of, women on different sides of the divide, that this sort of awful kind of gap we have now, where you're having to constantly negotiate these terms like first world feminism and what does it mean and all that. I think just in an odd way, even though colonialism was there, so the power disparity was much more heightened in some sense, there was another way in which an English woman in sort of 1910, 1915, who didn't have the right to vote, who didn't really go and stand in Parliament, and a woman of Peshawar, there would have been a certain way at that point, they would have been on a similar wavelength that, I mean, today they would see divisions.
And let us not forget that women then couldn't own property. They had no control over their finances. They were owned by their husbands or their fathers. So, it's very much so. Ahdaf.
Yeah, it sounds like we're all writing the same novel. Well, basically, I chose Anna Winterbourne for Map of Love because I wanted a story where they, the man and the woman were coming from two sides of a conflict, and so she was English, and that placed her on one side of a conflict, but also because there is this figure of the English woman traveller in the Middle East, and there is this sort of bossy, what was it?
Gertrude Bell.
Gertrude Bell, and various other people like her. But there was also another figure, and for me it was Lucy Duff Gordon, who had. Thank you. For me it was Lucy Duff Gordon, who had travelled to Egypt for her health, but had found so much more there, and had written had actually, just taken the place as it was, and written very sympathetically of it, and found a place for herself, rather in the manner of Marion's people, although not quite, where she set up in Luxor for the heat, but she provided medicine for people, and so people would come to visit the English woman with their ailments, and they would go away with pills and drops, and they would give her eggs and chicken and bread, and so that was how she lived and supported herself. So I was interested in that possibility of an open heart, and then with Anna, because of her circumstances, it also became clear that there was so much affinity. Once she actually got into the domestic, once she got beyond being English and a foreigner and an honorary man, and so living in the men's area and thinking of the women as enclosed behind these lattices and curtains, once she got behind that, then not only was she able to obviously find that affinity that comes with preparing meals and loving children and so on, but also she joined in the political struggle, which was the same. It was women demanding a voice, demanding a vote, and on their own terms. And of course, at that time, the commissioner, ambassador in Egypt who ran everything was Lord Cromer. And Lord Cromer was, on the one hand, proclaiming that Egyptians could not be ready for independence and to run themselves until they had liberated their women. And how could a country be independent when 50% of its population was behind the veil? And on the other hand, he was one of the staunchest protectors of the status quo in England and totally against giving women the vote. I mean, was very vocal in Parliament and in public speech against giving English women, British women, the vote. And so that whole hypocrisy that came with empire and with colonial rule and with patriarchal sort of dominance and so on was actually oppressing both the English women and the Egyptian women. And Anna found common cause in the harem, that they were making, they were deciding on producing magazines, that they were talking about education and a voice in Parliament and so on. And so that sort of, it started in one place. It didn't move to another, but it moved to a much more amplified version of that place.
And when you were, well, all three of you writing your books, did you have literary antecedents that were with you in your head, or not at all? Marion, what about you? Do you have anything?
Well, Alexandra asked me this question yesterday, and it was interesting. It took me a few minutes to find the answer, but the answer is very clear in my mind, and since we spoke yesterday, it's become clearer. Perhaps I can just start by saying something about the sort of equivalent to the historical things that you were both drawing on, because although my novel is set in 1997, it is a reflection partly on what has been happening in Tajikistan in all the years before this hostage-taking incident. And that was actually the spur to write the novel, was that I was privileged to visit Tajikistan in 1997, in the period I set my book, and my mind was blown by my ignorance and by what I was learning just in a few weeks of being there on that first visit. The ignorance, I think, is due to the fact that, you know, those of us in the West who grew up with the Soviet Union as a great big bloc, it was like a big blob on the map, and you knew absolutely nothing about what was happening in its Asian areas, so that the names themselves were kind of unknown. When Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan came onto the world map and the atlases had to be redesigned, those words were completely foreign in the West. And so foreign, in fact, that one of my friends, well-educated woman in Britain, who read my novel, who loved it, who said, this country, Tajikistan, that you've set it in, is it real or did you make it up? Now, it isn't actually, most readers would know that it is a real country, but they would know very little about it beyond that. And when I went there first for Save the Children, I was invited to work with staff of a project that Save the Children had been supporting, and from the people who were working in that project, I began to learn a great deal about their antecedents and their history that they were dealing with. And they were all women. The project was to support women who had been widowed in the war, to give them the means of livelihood so that they could start supporting their own families and that their children wouldn't become destitute. And in running that project, the person in charge of it had decided only to recruit widows to work in the project, so that they themselves would understand exactly what people were dealing with. And the widows were recruited from both sides of the civil conflict. So they were all working together in a number of villages in the most badly affected part of the country in the war, which is the south Kurgan-Tepe area, north of Afghanistan. I was told this story by the person who was running the project, of a woman who subsequently became a very good friend of mine, that she was in a village working with children who were of the opposite clan from the one she came from. And somebody from her own clan said to her very angrily, "Why are you helping these children? It's these people who killed your husband." And she said, "We'll probably never know who killed my husband, but I know it wasn't these children." And that made such an impression on me. I thought it was such a thing I wanted to share with other people that had got into the novel, straight. But actually, the novel is infused by my feeling that there were stories there that needed telling, and that very few people in the rest of the world were privileged to hear them. That these women had grown up in the Soviet era. They were products of the better aspects of the Soviet system. They were well-educated women. If the Soviet era had not existed, they would not have been. But they had a very strong sense of their cultural roots. And one of the things that was a delightful surprise for me, again out of my ignorance, I'd known that most of the Central Asian republics have Turkic languages, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Kazakh, they're quite closely related. But Tajikistan, they speak Persian. It's not, you can say it's a dialect of Persian because it's got some different words and it's got a different accent, but it is Persian. It is Farsi, as spoken in northern Afghanistan, which they call Dari, as spoken in Iran. They call it Tajik, but it is Persian. And having learned Urdu myself, and having studied some Urdu poetry, I was hearing poetic words all around me all the time because they come from Persian. And I thought, I felt a cultural connection that I had never expected to feel in a place. So all of these things made me feel here are amazing stories. These people are living this life which includes the Soviet era, which they never thought was going to end. It includes their Tajik traditions, which they're now freer to rediscover. It includes the effects of economic collapse and civil war, and being widowed in the case of these people. So those women inspired me to feel their story should be heard and should somehow be woven into the stories of my novel. So there is a slight connection with that and the women of an earlier era that you two.
So it's stories and poetry, really, that brought you to this point.
Kamila, what about you?
One of the books that I return to again and again, which is, its shadow is there in A Garden Every Stone and in Burnt Shadows, is Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient, which of course has archaeologists, has war, has people from different nations and all of that. So that's in there. But I think it's sometimes the texts that influence you are the ones you are writing against rather than with. And when I was writing A Garden Every Stone, I was writing against a certain kind of colonial narrative where you had, the English woman arrives in British India, and it's all so colorful and wonderful, but it's also so cruel, and that's the basic story. And then there's some Indian, and oh, he's so romantic, but he's so different, and they can't understand each other. And I really want to write against that very tired thing, because of course the overarching structure of all of that is an acceptance of empire. And as soon as you start from the position of not accepting empire as basically a jolly good thing for all its problems, you're telling a different sort of story. So I wasn't interested, except peripherally, in the resident and whoever the power brokers were. And I wanted it to be a story of outsiders. So you have Viv, who, because she's a woman on her own and quite independent, she's sort of an outsider to polite British society. And then you have Qayyum Gul, who's had been an Indian soldier with the British Indian Army, fighting with the forted Pathans, but then increasingly becomes drawn to Rafal Khan and becomes an anti-imperial activist. But what I also wanted was very early on to bring them together. So they meet in a train carriage going to Peshawar. And in another kind of story, that would be the beginning of the love story.
Yeah, and you won't let us have that.
I won't let. Cruelly, I won't. So I bring them together. Yes. They're interested. There is a certain personal connection, but they are divided both by the fact that they're colonized, and again by class.
But you also, though, have the different kind of love relationship with his younger brother that grows up over language, which is an interesting thing. The teaching of language and the whole thing that love goes across political. Linguistic divides, and you have that as well in Burnt Shadows.
Yeah, so Qayyum's younger brother Najib ends up as this English woman student, and it's almost as though he's this, sort of in my mind, this proxy, that this relationship between the two adults can't happen because these divisions. He's a boy, and therefore, in a certain way, unthreatening. He's 11 years old. So he has a relationship with his brother Qayyum, and he also has a relationship with this English woman who's his teacher. And so there's this sort of, he's what's bringing them together, and in the end, he's really what's bringing them together, literally. But they have to have these separate lives. And I was sort of, I suppose part of what was in there is that one of the cruelties of empire is these deep divisions it created, and that's in Burnt Shadows as well, about people who are not allowed literally to be in the same room together. And therefore, all this human potential for love is simply destroyed. And that is, of course, what all the barriers you have, whether it's of class, ethnicity, sexuality, culture, in some very personal way to a novelist, what you're looking at is these loves can't happen because as a dramatist, you cannot find a realistic way to bring these people together without it being this extraordinary transgression. And sometimes you write about the extraordinary transgression, and sometimes it's just the ghost in the room.
Okay. And Ahdaf, am I right in thinking that George Eliot was in some way an inspiration for your first novel?
Well, I think that it was the novels that I read as I was growing up that have really formed my my literary taste. Yeah, so George Eliot was very powerful. And I used to skip. The thing is also that when you read novels when you're very young, you think they're about love. And then you read the same novels again later, and you realize that they're about money, and they're about, you know, social struggles and all sorts of things. So I read George Eliot when I was very young, and for me it was, The Mill on the Floss and Middlemarch. Those are really the two novels. Adam Bede. But so they were about women who were bigger than their circumstances naturally allowed them to be, and also this capacity for love was bigger and more dramatic than their circumstances allowed, and that was, yeah. So that was big, and also Anna Karenina was very much sort of part of what formed me, and Colette, because I thought that Colette does love magnificently. I mean, it is at the center, but also it sort of so affects everything. It is what moves and shapes everything, or at least that's what it looks like, and it's really beautifully done. So I guess really those, plus of course the mountains of Mills and Boon that I read in early adolescence.
Well, picking up on that, I'd like to go through again, picking up on a word from Kamila, the word transgression, because I think you can't talk about love and just talk about romantic love. I think you have to talk about transgressive love, and it's very interesting that, for example, when you think of one of the most transgressive novels is Nabokov's Lolita, but actually, way before Lolita was published, there were women writing stories along those lines about teenage girls having relationships with much older men. And very famously, there was a novel called The Constant Nymph that was published in 1924, which was based on the family of Augustus John, the Bohemian painter, about a 14-year-old girl. But it's all told from the point of view of the girl and her absolutely passionate love for a grown-up man. And then actually Edith Wharton, in her very little-known novel, The Children, writes about a 15-year-old girl falling in love with a man in his 40s. And they're all, again, geographically displaced. I think there's a connection here. And with The Constant Nymph, they're in the Tyrol. The Edith Wharton, they're on a cruise ship, so they're literally nowhere. And the effect this has on all these families that are stuck together through divorces. And of course, Marguerite Duras, much later than Lolita, in The Lover, and people don't express horror at the fact that she has a 15-year-old girl who transgresses in every way because she's French and she goes off with a Chinese man who is much older than her. And then even going on to the Mills and Boon side of this, there's sort of erotica, and you can't get away from the whole 50 Shades of Grey monster that's there sitting in every room when you talk about these things. But in the 1920s, there was a novel called The Sheikh by E.M. Hull, written by a very respectable English farmer's wife, about a young woman being kidnapped by a sheikh and basically multiply raped, and then she finds out that she likes it, and then they fall in love, and then guess what? It turns out it's okay because he's not an Arab, he's French. So it's basically sexist and racist, but it is an astonishingly erotic book to read, and as Carmen Khalil, who founded the feminist press Virago, said, it's the original G-spot novel. So writing about sex and love in transgressive ways is a difficult thing to do. And so how do you go about it? Marion, do you feel like picking up on that?
Yes, I'm happy to, because the central love story in my novel is transgressive in the sense, I had never thought of using that word, but it fits the category, because the young woman who is very, very deeply in love with the central character, Rahul Khan, arrives as a backpacker in India and gets, by a series of accidents, meets him, gets taken to this village project that he's supporting, and basically feels like a door has opened up and this is something she wants to do. She stays as a volunteer on this project for months and months, most of a year, and he sort of fits in and out, and he's this charismatic founder of the project and so on, and she's kind of a hero worshipping him from afar, but feels that they're soul's mates. which in fact they do turn out to be, and they do have a relationship, which never comes to fruition, basically because he's totally focused on his work and on his political commitment. When I was a girl, a young boy that I was quite keen on had another girlfriend, and I heard him say to somebody once, well, he just told his girlfriend he couldn't actually see her much for the next few months because it was the cricket season. And I think it's a thing that hits men more than women, that something really important about their work takes over, or their cricket or whatever, and love has to just go on the side for a little bit. And Rahul Khan is totally involved in his very demanding kind of work that he actually doesn't it doesn't allow the relationship to take the road it could have taken. So she, on the rebound, marries someone else. And I don't want to go any further in the story because I don't want to spoil it for you, but basically her feelings about him didn't change. And when he disappears, she is traumatized because he was the biggest figure in her life and he's gone. So what she is working out in her dealing with loss is not just loss, but also dealing with the whole morality of what she had allowed herself to get into in continuing to love somebody when she was married to somebody else. So, yes, it's transgressive. But as I was thinking about it, Rahul Khan is somebody who's been brought up with Urdu poetry in his background. His father's an Urdu speaker, and he's grown up hearing it from early on. And one of the cross-cultural things in this story is that he, when he's alone and lonely and isolated spots, he begins translating Urdu poetry, and in his mind wanting to share it with his lost love, who wouldn't be able to know it in English. So the Urdu poetry kind of punctuates their story. And if you think about the love that Urdu poetry celebrates, I learnt Urdu from a wonderful man called Ralph Russell, who was an Englishman but a great scholar of Urdu literature and was passionate about trying to share the beauties of Urdu literature with English speakers. So he spent his life studying and translating. And he said the way you have to understand the thing about the ghazal is it's not comprehensible to anybody outside Urdu-speaking society unless you understand it's the poetry of illicit love. It's of a kind of love that you can never fulfill. And that accounts for its deep agonizing and the fact that it's not happy poetry. It's deep, soulful, tragic poetry. And if you think of, any quotation from any of the Ghalib Mir, the love poets, Hazaron khaish aisi ke har khaish pe dam nikle, bahut nikle mere arman lekin phir bhi kam nikle. Which Ralph translated, I think, very beautifully as desires in thousands, each so strong it takes away my breath anew. Many longings have been fulfilled, many, but even so, too few. And that is a summary of the kind of love that doesn't get fulfilled. Like, you can just keep on quoting and quoting them. They're all like that. Unity, hamari kismet ke. Go on, do it for me. If I had gone on living, I would still be waiting. It wasn't in our fate that we were going to get together. We would always have had to wait. So there's a tragicness, a sense that the deepest love is often the one that cannot be fulfilled. We cannot have the Mills and Boon solution.
Well, but we can dream of them.
Actually, my aunt who used to take out about 10 different Mills and Boon every week of the life that I knew her. And she never married. She said she didn't envy other women their husbands at all, but she did envy them their children. But she just passionately read Mills and Boon.
But I think you can't get over the fact that millions of people, women in particular, have read 50 Shades of Grey, which, in a sense, is a Mills and Boon. It's the same thing for the new century. So there we are. There's a lot to be said about that, but I think we might have some questions. We've just got 10 minutes. Is there a microphone? Do we have a microphone? Yeah? Okay. There's a gentleman in the front there.
Hello. Mine is a question come comment, and it is for all the lovely ladies sitting up there. I'm going to just draw a cross-cultural comparison, if I'm allowed to. I'm not going to say Western countries, I'm going to say Christian countries, because that would include Africa as well, not just Europe and America. In Christian countries, the basic source of culture is obviously religion, like other countries, and the basic concept is love. God loves you, that is the basic concept in Christianity, and the culture, religion being the main source of culture, that is the concept which dominates the culture. And those people who don't go to church, even they, without knowing it, they practice. Whereas the basic concept in Islam is Khuda se daro, means be afraid of God, which means fear is the basic concept in Islam. So please forgive me for saying this. I'm a Muslim. I was born in Pakistan and brought up there. I'm just inviting your opinion. But I lived in the West for 11 years as well. So I like to say, I like to understand that I understand both cultures very well. And I'm going to invite your opinion that the concept of love is better understood and used in Christian countries, whereas the concept of love is not as well understood and used in Muslim world, because the basic concept is fear in Muslim world, but the basic. So I'm inviting your opinion. I may be wrong, but I need your guidance.
But
Thank
I
you.
think that you just need to. Ahdaf, did you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this first intervention. I think actually the problem with statements like this is that it's not possible to make such generalizations. I mean, really, to make a statement like this is just, there's nowhere you can go with that. So we can say that we disagree or that we agree, but there's nowhere to go with it. So I think we can
pass on. Okay, next question, please. There's a lady back there. Where's the microphone? Do we have the microphone?
Could you raise your hand again so they can see you? Yeah, just stand up.
She's just, if you stand up
with
in
the
the middle,
flowers on your
white,
sleeve.
yeah. Thank you.
Hi, so you talked about transgressive literature, Mills and Boons and 50 Shades, which may not be the best example of literature out there, but it does engage readers and it sells a lot of copies. So do you feel at some point you as authors or writers are compelled to add in love story as a central plot or a secondary plot to your novels, to not just to add drama but also to attract more readers? Thank you.
Thank you.
The question was, do you, as a lot of people are drawn to love literature, do you as writers feel compelled to add love stories in for the purpose of drawing readers rather than for other things? I haven't ever felt that. I mean, the sort of stories grow quite organically. Love is an interesting thing to write about because there is within it conflict and possibility. And, I mean, we all write novels that have many other things in them as well, but it is a significant part of sort of human experience. And there are, I mean, if we talk about cross-cultural romance, we don't have to go to Mills and Boons. You can go to Othello, right? In fact, if you look up cross-cultural marriage on Wikipedia, the picture that comes up is Othello and Desdemona, so it's clearly a warning sign.
And the interesting thing I think about Othello is that Desdemona falls in love with Othello because of the stories he tells her of his adventures, of the wars he's been in. He spins these stories, he opens new lands to a woman who lives a very confined life. Yeah. And I think love as an agent of change is an incredibly important thing, and in all your novels very much so.
I want to quickly say that Chimamanda Adichie said something last year. She was being interviewed. So she was sort of black African woman being interviewed by a man called James Ramsey, who's a white Englishman. And there was some joke where he, about the difference between them. And she said, well, it's true, James, for you to the closest you'd be able to get to understanding what it is to be an African woman, well, you would have to fall in love with me. Which she was quite happy to do. But she said, because when you fall in love, then the person's skin is almost like your own skin, so their hurts are your hurts. So that sort of dissolving of boundaries, which of course is deep in Sufi poetry. So it's there are all kinds of ways in which you can talk about it. is just a very powerful thing.
And I think it's also one of three things that create great changes. One is politics, the other is economics. It's like the way trade winds have blown people across, great tracts of the world. And love, those are really the three things. And you're looking at all of them together. You can't separate them, can you? So another question? At the back there. Thank you.
My question basically is, can love, the experience, the whole feeling of it be described in literature, or is it something that you only experience? Can it completely wholesomely be described in book or in drama or anything like that?
Did you hear that?
Do you have to experience love yourself, or can experiencing it in a novel, to what extent is that the experience of love? It's a good question.
That is such a good question. That is such a good question. Well, I think that one of the claims that we make for literature, particularly for narrative fiction, is that it enables you to live many, many lives that you couldn't have lived otherwise, and that in doing so, they make you into somebody, I don't know, more battered, more empathetic, more automatically able to put yourself in other people's shoes. So what follows on from that, I guess, is that yes, you can, logically, what would follow on from this position is that you can experience love through experiencing love as a reader of a novel. And maybe for many of us that's our first experience of love, and maybe that actually colors how we think of, how we even treat love afterwards. I know that a refrain from my mother and my aunt to me was, "You don't think you're living a novel, do you?" And I always thought I was. Why not be living a novel?
Great. I suppose the difference might be is from reading. I might know what it felt like for Desdemona to be in love, and then you think, well, would it feel the same if I were in love? So maybe there's sort of that interesting is you enter these skins of these other people, and then maybe you want to know what it would feel like in your own skin. But yes, you do. There is, as novelists, we have to believe that it is possible to imaginatively enter worlds and experiences.
Well, of course. Otherwise, why do people cry when they're reading something sad? Or why do you want to carry on turning the page? Or why do you want terrible things not to happen? Or even, I was just reading Simone de Beauvoir's The Mandarins, and I had tried to read this when I was 19, 20, and I thought it was the most boring text in the world, and I couldn't get beyond page 25. And a couple of months ago, I started reading it, and it was like, where have you been all my life? It was the book that was speaking, and possibly actually, just to be fair, not the bits about love, not the bits where she goes to America and falls in love, but all the bits in Paris with the politics just after the Nazi withdrawal and what was happening to the artists and intellectuals who were part of the resistance, and all the conversation. It was very, and at the end, I did that thing that I'd heard that people did, but I'd never done before. That when I got to the last 20 pages, I really slowed down because I didn't want it to be over. So you obviously, if a book evokes such feelings, then yes, you do and can, as Kamila said, experience love through it. Yeah, thank you for that question.
I think this is a very, very important point, which is why do we read novels? And we read novels to understand the world that we live in and the world that's gone before us. And these three writers beautifully do that. They take us into worlds, into history, and they do it and into all sorts of different situations. And at the end of reading them, you feel you understand much more than you did before. And it is often through the thread of love. It's a bit like the thread that takes you through the forest in a fairy tale. It's one of the ways that a writer can steer you through. So I'd just like to end this by saying, read their books and fall in love with them, because that's an important way that we love, is by falling in love with books. So they're all on sale at the bookshop, and I'd like to say thank you so much to all three of them for their wonderful contributions. Thank you.